Scripture reading is from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons, invited them to the sacrifice. He consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Verse 6, when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and was beautiful and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah.
This statue of Abraham Lincoln is one with which I have a personal connection. It is located 10 miles from the house where I grew up in Laramie, Wyoming. But the personal connection goes even deeper than that. The artist who designed this statue, a man by the name of Robert Russian, also did a sketch of my father in celebration of a piano trio of which my father was a part at the University of Wyoming in the late 70s and 1980s. He did a sketch of each of the members of that trio. And I remember growing up, the sketch of my father hanging on the wall in our house. Interestingly enough, I called my parents this week and I asked them, I said, "Can you send me a picture? Can you send me a picture of the sketch?" And they didn't know where it was. They couldn't recall where it was. And I thought to myself, I'm like, really? You don't know where it is? And it's possible that they don't know where it is. They have moved a lot in the last 20 years. They're also getting older, so they might be going a little senile. That's certainly possible. But I suspect there's another answer here, and that is that I think my mom knows very well what happened to that sketch. Because I think that during a troubling time in their marriage a number of years ago, she toppled down that sketch in an act of protest. My mother always has been a woman ahead of her time. Today we are kicking off a brand new series on the life of David. The life of David, the life of King David. And we're going to be looking at his life. We're going to be looking at it as it appears, especially in the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, though we might branch out into some other places as well. And we're going to be exploring his life. And the question that we're going to be asking throughout this series is, in what ways is David a hero? And in what ways is he not really a hero? In what ways should we look up to him as a hero? And in what ways should we perhaps not see him as a hero? And then from that, we can draw some principles that we can apply in our own lives about what really should we value in a person? What should we see as being heroic? What is something that we should revere? Who is somebody that we should revere? You know, who should we make statues of? If we make statues of anybody, who should we make statues of? And maybe who really it would be more appropriate to give them a sketch, right? You know, my father, I love my father. He's wonderful. But I think we would both agree he's probably not worthy of a public statue. No offense, Dad, but a sketch is probably more appropriate. So who is worthy of a statue? But more importantly, what does a hero really look like? That's the question we're going to be addressing time and time again throughout this series. Now, as we come to this text, the text that Ray read, chapter 16 in 1 Samuel, we're going to get into this. We're going to look at David, and we're going to see something about David. But what I want us to see first in this passage is not something about David, but something about God. The first thing we need to see that emerges from this text is about God. You see, we often look to the text trying to figure out something about ourselves, for ourselves, but we really need to start when we look at the Bible and say, what can I learn about God from this? And as we look at this passage in 1 Samuel chapter 16, here's what emerges, what we're going to discover in this passage. What this passage points to, hints at, is this truth about God. And that is that God makes significant the insignificant. He frees the oppressed, and he brings the marginalized in from the margins. God makes significant the insignificant. He frees the oppressed, and he brings the marginalized in from the margins. When we look at the book of 1 Samuel, let me just give you a little bit of context moving into this. The book of 1 Samuel chronicles for us a transitional period in the life of the people of Israel. A transition between what was known as the period of the judges and the monarchy, the period of the kings. This scene, this scenario, David's life and whatnot, takes place in the 11th century BC. And prior to David, there was this approximately a 200-year period of the judges. And essentially, that was a period where the form of government in Israel was really just a loose confederacy of tribes. There was not really any sort of central government. You had these tribes, these 12 tribes that were loosely associated by their religious beliefs, associated by their culture, associated by their common past experience, etc. But actually, what would happen is they had these judges that would emerge as leaders, and they would emerge in times of crisis. That's really when these leaders would arise. So some sort of crisis would arise in some area in one of these tribes, and a leader would emerge within that local community to help them deal with that struggle. So these judges were really more had jurisdiction over sort of a local area in a time of crisis. Of course, they would call on and request help from the other tribes to come and assist them. And so this sort of thing happened time and time again over the course of 200 years, and this worked relatively well until the Philistines came. And the Philistines had been there, but they started to become more and more prominent, especially in the 11th century. And the Philistines were one of what is known as the Sea Peoples, a group of peoples that in and around that time began to migrate from Greece and that sort of area, and they began to migrate east to Palestine and began to settle on the coast of Palestine. And the Philistines were a warrior nation, okay? They were like, if you're like a Star Trek fan, they're like the Klingons, okay? It's like the Klingons are coming in and moving in, right? Everything about them was about preparing and training a society that is prepared for war. And so as the Philistine threat grew, this loosely associated tribe tribal confederacy just wasn't cutting it anymore, at least that's how the people saw it. And so we find this transition to the monarchy, where they get a king who now has more control, more sort of central jurisdiction. And Samuel, the prophet Samuel, plays the primary role in helping to establish this. And what we discover in the early chapters in 1 Samuel is that he appoints the first king. He seeks God's will for who the king will be. He appoints Saul, and that doesn't go very well. Saul actually seems to overstep the boundaries of church and state. Can't seem to understand that there needs to be a line there. Starts to step into what Samuel sees as his jurisdiction. Samuel doesn't like this, so Samuel rejects Saul, and that's where we are here as we come to this passage. He's now looking to fill the vacancy that has been made by Saul's rejection. So we come to this scene here, and God tells Samuel to go to this man Jesse, to Jesse's house in Bethlehem. So he comes to Bethlehem, and I think it's interesting that the Bethlehemites are scared. They're terrified of Samuel because Samuel has a tremendous amount of power, and they don't know, man, is he coming to bless us? Is he coming to rebuke us? And so they ask him, are you coming in peace? It was a time when people were scared. And sure enough, he says, I've come in peace. Now, the first thing that he does is he does this sacrifice. He invites Jesse to come to a sacrifice to Yahweh. And I'd say that there are really two reasons for this sacrifice. One is, if you think about it, what Samuel is doing is he's coming here to seek the Lord's will for a new king. Kind of a big deal, right? So it seems like part of what's going on here is needing to get right with God, right? He wants to be able to hear from God, and so he does this religious ceremony, this sacrifice, as a way to try to get in the right frame of mind with God. And I think just as a side note, we can glean from that something pretty significant. When you have a big decision coming up in your life, it's important to take time to come before God, to get right with God, so that you can hear where God is leading you. I remember a particular time in my life when I had a couple of big decisions to make, and I'm trying to hear from the Lord, trying to sense, where is God leading me? But then I realized, I'm like, Kevin, your relationship with God is not in a place where you're going to be able to hear from God. You need to get right with God first if you have any hope of actually being able to hear from God. So I think at one level, that's what's going on here. You want to get right with God before you hear from God on who to appoint as king. And then, of course, there's the second reason, and that's to deceive Saul, to fool him, because Samuel knows that if Saul finds out that he's going around trying to find the next king, Saul's going to come after him. Saul is going to kill him. So this is a way of deceiving him, right? He's like, I'm doing this religious service. That's why I'm going. Look, I don't know why those of you who are here in the sanctuary, I'm so glad that you're here. We're glad that you're here. I hope that you're here because you wanted to come and be in the presence of God and maybe get right with God. On the other hand, it might have just been a convenient excuse to get out of the house. You're like, oh my gosh, I've got to go to church, right? Multiple layers of why he does this sacrifice. Anyway, so then they end up at Jesse's house, and we have this scene where Jesse parades his sons in front of Samuel. It's sort of like in Cinderella, when the sisters are all going through and they're trying on the shoe to see if it fits, who's going to be the princess, and same thing here, like the shoe just doesn't fit any of these sons of Jesse. So we come then to verses 11 and 12, says this, Then Samuel said to Jesse, Are all your sons here? And he said, There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. Okay, the description that we find in these verses here is a description that really seeks to communicate one thing, and that is that David is the least likely candidate for this position. He is the least likely one. Okay, ruddy, it says he's ruddy, which probably in this context means he had a clear complexion. A clear complexion, and he was young and good looking. So in other words, David was young, good looking. David would have been a great candidate for a TV show. David would have been a great candidate if they were going to make a movie about David, right? So he'd be a great guy to play himself in the movie. But to actually be David, to actually be the king, he doesn't fit the bill, right? I mean, they're going to be going up against this experienced warrior nation of the Philistines. And this individual, he's young, he's inexperienced, he doesn't have any sort of this battle history. He's also the youngest, which in that culture, just by virtue of being the youngest, in some respects, you were destined to have a life of marginalization, that you were always going to be having to look up to and serve the elder brother, always had sort of the upper hand. That was just your station in life for being the youngest son. So Jesse doesn't even invite David to come, right? He's like, this is an adult conversation. You don't invite the kids in for the adult conversation. Verse 12b, and the Lord said, after David comes in, arise, anoint him, for this is he. God brings David in out from the margins. Brings them into the center of the story, right? You've got the margins on the side of the page, and then you've got the story. He brings them in out of the margins into the center of the story. This is what God does. God makes the insignificant significant. He frees the oppressed from oppression, and he brings the margins in from the marginalized. And actually, this idea of bringing in the marginalized in from the margins, this idea of making significant the insignificant, we actually see this in all three of the main characters in this story. We see this in David, as I've already seen, but we can also see it in Samuel and Jesse. Samuel, let's talk about Samuel for a minute. Excuse me. Samuel, it's not COVID, I promise, just a little dry. It's a little dry. Samuel is the son of Hannah. And who's Hannah? Well, let me read for you what it says. Thank you, Jen. That was a subtle plea for help. Here we are in the beginning of 1 Samuel, beginning in verse 1, reading verses 1 and 2. Here's what it says about Hannah. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroam, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name, we'll discuss the 2 wives some other sermon. That's not for today. The name of the one was Hannah, and the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now, one of the hardest things, one of the greatest hardships for a woman can be not having the ability to have children. And that is true today, and that was especially true in the ancient world. That in the ancient world, in that culture, a woman's worth and value was virtually almost one-to-one identified with their ability to have children. So by virtue of her inability to have children, she was immediately marginalized. She was on the margin. She was insignificant. Of course, we read in that first chapter the story of her praying to God, seeking God out, and sure enough, God brings her out from the margins into the story, and she gives birth to Samuel. Samuel's existence is because we have a God who brings the marginalized in from the margins. That's Samuel. What about Jesse? Well, who's Jesse? Jesse is the grandson of Ruth. If you go back and you read the book of Ruth, who is Ruth? Well, Ruth was a Moabite woman, not an Israelite. She was a foreigner who married an Israelite who then died. So her husband dies. She doesn't have any children. She finds herself in Israel as a foreigner. And literally, you find her walking along the margins of the field, picking up whatever is left over from the harvest. She's literally living in the margins. And what does God do? He brings her out of the margins. She marries Boaz, and it becomes through her that the line of David comes. She goes from being insignificant to having a name, her name, the name of a book in the Bible. God takes the insignificant, makes him significant. He frees the oppressed from oppression. He brings the marginalized in from the margins. And of course, in all of these examples, it all points to the ultimate example of that. And that was the story of a small child, a small baby born in a manger, born in obscurity, so insignificant that he did not even have a place to be born in the town of Bethlehem. Jesus, born insignificant, God brought him. He died. He died as a common criminal, died in obscurity. But God raised him from the dead and gave him the name above all names, making him the most significant person in all of history. God takes the marginalized, brings them in from the margins. He frees the oppressed. He makes significant the insignificant. Because here's what we need to realize, okay? Here's just, I'm going to put it bluntly here. Apart from God, we are all insignificant. Apart from God, we are all on the margins. Apart from God, we are all insignificant. Psalm 8, 3-4 says this: "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" The psalmist is looking up at the stars. He's like, we are so insignificant. My son, Caleb, he's 6 years old, and he's at this stage in his life where he's literally fascinated with everything. It's really fun. It's really fun. We got into this conversation just the other day about how you weigh a different weight depending on what planet you're on. Did you know this? It's true. So he's like, what? How much would I weigh if I was on Jupiter? How much would I weigh if I was on the moon? I'm calculating it. I mean, I don't really know how to calculate it, but I just know that it's different. He loves the fact that on the moon, he could probably jump over a car. He just thinks that's incredible. He's just fascinating. He loves to talk about speed, like how fast something is. He asked me the other day, what's faster, Daddy? A cheetah or a T-Rex? I don't know, buddy. He started talking about the speed of sound and the speed of light. Do you guys realize how fast the speed of light is? Get this. You ready for this? If you could travel the speed of light in 1 second, you could travel around the earth 7.5 times. In 1 second, around the earth 7.5 times. That's how fast light is. Now, take a look at this picture. If we could bring it up here. Okay. This is our galaxy. This is where we live. Get this. Remembering how fast light is. To travel from one side of that galaxy to the other, if you were traveling the speed of light, it would take over 100,000 years. There'd be a lot to see, fortunately, because there are hundreds of billions of stars, of which we go around just one. You notice in the center of it there, that's where all the action takes place. Lots of stars all jammed together. They're in the middle. They're not practicing social distancing there. If COVID jumps to stars, they're going to have a real problem in the middle there, right? Do you guys know where we are in this galaxy? We're out in the boonies, folks. We're out in the margins. We are out tending the sheep. Rather, the center, that's Jesse's house. That's where all the action's happening. We're out here tending the sheep. We are insignificant. Except we're not. Because God says we're not. Because we matter to God. I say this all the time. It's so important to remember this. God doesn't love you because you are significant. You are significant because God loves you. That's what makes you significant. I mean, look, you think God's going to be impressed with whatever you accomplish on our little planet, around our little star, in the middle of nowhere? You're not significant. God doesn't love you because you're significant. You're significant because God loves you. God makes us significant, and we have a God who longs to take that which is insignificant and make it significant. That's the first thing about God that we discover from this passage. Second thing we discover about God from this passage is this. God uses the most willing people, not the most capable. God uses the most willing, not the most capable. And this is what emerges in this passage in verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at, talking about one of the other brothers. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, over the course of this series, we'll unpack more and more what it means that David was a man after God's own heart. That's something that we see over and over again. David was a man after God's own heart. But I would say that, at least in part, a central part of what that is that David was willing to do whatever God called him to do. And that's what it was about. You see, because God uses the willing, not the most capable. In Jesse's eyes, David was not qualified. David was to be marginalized because he wasn't qualified. And that's what we do when we marginalize people. You realize that? When we marginalize people, whether it's just marginalizing an individual or it's marginalizing an entire race or however it is that we marginalize people, the way we do that is we think, well, they're not capable. Something in us says they're not capable. They don't quite measure up to it. And of course, time and time again, certainly in the case of race, we discover that that's never true. That's just not true. There is not one race that is superior to another. Time and time again, we discover that's just not true. But listen, and if we marginalize somebody, you marginalize your friend. Jesse marginalizes David, doesn't think that he's capable for this particular position. Here's the thing. Even if it's true that they're not capable, it still misses the point. Because to be used by God isn't about how capable you are. It's about how willing you are. God's power, not our ability, is what enables anything of significance to happen. This is true across the board. It is God's power, not our ability, that enables anything significant to happen. I would argue that in history, in human history, anything significant that has ever happened is ultimately because of the hand of God. It's ultimately God working through. You know, there's this Leslie Newbegin, a missiologist and a missionary. He talks about how, I'll see if I can explain this. He talks about how in our society we often look at, or we look at scientific truth and spiritual truth, and we see them very differently. And we say that scientific truth is arrived at through a long process, systematic reasoning, and spiritual truth just kind of comes out of nowhere, right? Just kind of comes out of nowhere. And what Newbegin goes on, and he's working with some of the work that Thomas Kuhn, a sociologist of knowledge, has pointed out, is that that's actually not quite accurate. That when you look at the major revolutions, scientific revolutions, Thomas Kuhn says that actually what happens has more the character of a religious conversion than of simply a simple, rational, logical process. And I think, actually, there's a movie that captures this incredibly well. One of my favorite movies of all time, Back to the Future. Yep, you didn't know how deep that movie is, I'm telling you. So there's this scene where Doc Brown, he's telling Marty about how he discovered time travel. He discovered time travel. That's pretty big, right? And he's explaining it to him. And you know what he says? He's like, well, I was in my bathroom, and I slipped on some water, and I fell, and I hit my head on the sink. And when I came to, I had a revelation. And Marty's like, what? A revelation. The flux capacitor. It's what makes time travel possible. And I love it because it's really Hollywoodized, but it's actually pretty accurate. That the major revolutions something kind of comes out of nowhere. And what Newbegin and Kuhn are pointing out is that actually some of these major scientific revolutions have more the character of Moses on Sinai. Just something comes out of nowhere than we often realize. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that scientific knowledge and education doesn't matter. I mean, if I hit my head on the sink and saw the flux capacitor, I'm like, what is this, a new kind of toothbrush? I mean, I wouldn't know what to do with it, right? So it does matter that you have an education and you know what to do with that, right? The point is, in all of these situations, it's ultimately the hand of God, the hand of providence that makes anything of note happen. It's God's power, not our ability. Okay, so we've seen this about God. Now we can finally get to, I think, begin to hone in here. What is a hero? Who should we view as heroic? And I'd say this. A true hero is someone that lets God be the hero through them. A true hero is someone who lets God be the hero through them. We see that that's what goes on here with Samuel, right? Samuel seems to be the central character, kind of dictating. No, he's not dictating anything. He's just going whatever God tells him to do. God's like, go to Bethlehem. Okay. Right? God's like, do a sacrifice. Okay. And God's like, nope, not that guy, not that guy, not that guy, not that guy. It's God working through him. God is the hero in the story. Samuel isn't the one who discovers David. Usher discovered Justin Bieber. You guys might not know that. It's true. Usher discovered Justin Bieber. Samuel did not discover David. God did. God working through Samuel. God is the hero of the story. So a true hero is someone who lets God be the hero through them. And lets God be the hero even at great risk, right? We see this. Samuel knows that his life is at risk in doing this. Saul could come after him, but he's willing to follow God, let God work through him even when there's risk involved. We will see that David will exemplify this over and over and over and over again in his life. He will allow God to be the hero through him. A true hero lets God be the hero through them, but doesn't demand that God use them. Doesn't demand that God be the hero through them. You know, David isn't like peeking in the window. Wait, what about me? No. He's just out tending the sheep. He's not like Cinderella who's going to do whatever she can to get to the ball. He's not like Simba who just can't wait to be king. No. No, he doesn't demand it. I love in the movie Amadeus, I reference this all the time. Salieri, this composer who has really good theology, actually. He's like, he realizes that all artistic gifting comes from God. He realizes it's all the hand of God. So he prays fervently, God, let me be your instrument. God, use me for your glory. And then when he uses Mozart to a greater degree than Salieri, he's bitter about You see, we can have a lot of false piety, I think, right? God, use me. Use me for greatness. I just want to be used by you to do something great. There can be false humility in that. A true hero is willing to be used by God, to let God be the hero, but doesn't demand it. So a true hero is a hero who lets God be the hero through them. A true hero is one who doesn't demand that God do that. And then finally, a true hero is someone who makes significant the insignificant, frees the oppressed from oppression, and brings the marginalized in from the margins. In other words, does exactly what God does. Again, we see this with Samuel. What does Samuel do? He is the instrument through which David, who's out on the margins, is brought into the main part of the story. David will be used by God to take a ragtag group of tribes that we would never have heard of. And God will use them to turn them into this great nation that emerges in the 11th century. God uses David to bring the marginalized in from the margins. That's what a hero does. So I think if we're going to talk about who are we going to revere as heroes, whether we make statues of them or however we decide to revere them, this is the question we need to ask. Are they famous for bringing the marginalized in from the margins? Are they famous for making significant the insignificant? Or are they famous for doing the opposite? Or are they famous for something else? A true hero in a Christian sense is one who brings the marginalized in from the margins. Here's my question for each and every one of us this morning. Are you willing to be used by God? Are you willing to be used by God? Are you willing? Not are you capable. I think a lot of times, honestly, in the service of the church, we say things like, I don't think I could do that. I don't think I'm capable of serving in the church. And sometimes I think it's just an excuse. It's a sign of humility. I'm not capable. I don't think I could do that. But is it really just masking that we don't want to? Because it's not about our capability. It's about our willingness. First question, are we willing to be used by God? Are you willing to let God be the hero and not you? Are you willing to let him use you however he wants to do that? Are you willing to let him be the hero and not you, for him to be the one that's lifted up and to not demand that you get the attention for this? And finally, how can God use you to make significant the insignificant? How can God use you? How can God use this church to bring the marginalized in from the margins? Because those are the true heroes. Anyone who does that, anyone who models that for us, does exactly that. Models for us what a true hero is, but they do more than that. When you find somebody who brings the marginalized in from the margins, when you find somebody who makes significant the insignificant, not only are they modeling for you how you should live, they are showing you what God looks like. Will you pray with me?